I booked the Airbnb because it was cheap, way cheaper than any hotel I could find near Phoenix where I had a job interview. The place was about 30 minutes out, which seemed fine at the time. What I didn't realize was just how isolated it actually was. The road leading up to it stretched for miles through the desert, nothing but sand, cacti, and the occasional abandoned-looking shack. My GPS took me down a dead-end dirt road, where the Airbnb stood alone, backed up against the endless expanse of the Arizona desert. No neighbors, no streetlights, just a small, old-looking house with a sun-faded porch and a dusty welcome mat that said, "Mi casa es su casa." I pulled into the driveway and checked my phone. Zero service. That was annoying. The host, Gary, had messaged me earlier, telling me where to find the key. I grabbed it from the little lockbox by the door and stepped inside. The place was weird. Sparse furniture, old TV, an odd smell that I couldn't quite place. But hey, I was only here for a few nights. The bedroom was small, with a basic bed and a closet with a door that didn't quite close all the way. I tossed my bag onto the bed and went to the living room to set up my laptop. That night, around 9 p.m., I was running through some last-minute prep for my interview.
Just me, my laptop, and the quiet hum of the desert night. Then I heard it. A tap on the window. Not a knock, more like a single finger tapping the glass. My head snapped toward the sound. The window was right next to the couch, but all I could see outside was blackness. The porch light barely illuminated a few feet beyond the house. I sat there, waiting, listening. Nothing. Maybe it was a bug. Arizona has some nasty insects after all. I shook it off and went back to my work.
The next day, my interview went well. At least I thought it did. I rewarded myself with some good food in town and drove around to explore. Phoenix was nice, but part of me was excited to get back to the Airbnb and just chill in the backyard, taking in the desert view. When I got back, I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and headed to the bedroom. Something felt off, like the air in the room was different. I looked at my bag. It was unzipped. I was sure I'd closed it before leaving. I checked inside, nothing missing, at least from what I could tell. Still, I didn't like that. That night, I was in the living room watching Breaking Bad on my laptop. Around 10 p.m., just as Walter White was cooking up his latest batch, it happened again. A single tap on the window. My stomach tightened. I paused the video and turned my head slowly. The window next to me faced the desert. Beyond that, nothing but darkness. I stood up and walked to the front door, checking the windows near it. Nothing, but I had to be sure. I opened the door, stepped outside onto the porch. The night air was cooler than I expected. Then I heard it. A clicking sound, not like an animal, not like the wind. It was a deliberate sound, a person clicking their tongue. It came from somewhere beyond the porch light's reach. My heart started pounding. Someone was out there, watching. I stayed frozen for a second, then yelled out, "Hey, you're on private property. I'm calling the cops." No response. Then just as I was about to step back inside, I saw them. A figure standing at the edge of the darkness, dressed in dark clothes, barely visible against the night. They stood completely still, watching me. I took a step forward. They took a step back. Then, in an instant, they turned and ran. Fast. Faster than I expected. I stood there, heart racing. What the hell was going on? I barely slept that night. Every little noise made me jolt awake, my mind playing tricks on me. The wind against the window, a hand scratching at the glass, the creak of the old house settling, a footstep in the hallway. By morning, I convinced myself that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was some local messing around, someone camping out in the desert trying to freak people out for fun. But then I stepped outside. The air was cool and still, the morning sun casting long shadows across the dry ground. I turned toward the backyard where the desert stretched out endlessly. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They led from the desert straight to my bedroom window. I froze. The prints were deep, like someone had been standing there for a long time. But the worst part? There were no footprints leading away. My mouth went dry. I scanned the area, my pulse hammering in my ears. Whoever had been watching me last night hadn't walked away. I checked my phone. Still no service. Screw this. I decided I was gonna leave. I started packing my bag when something else caught my eye. Something inside. The closet door in my room was slightly open. I never left it open. My stomach twisted. I walked over, every part of me screaming not to do it. But I had to. I grabbed the edge of the door and swung it open. Nothing. Just an empty space and some extra pillows stacked in the corner. I exhaled, shaking my head at myself. I was losing it. Still, I wasn't about to stay here another night. I grabbed my laptop, my keys, and my bag. I'd go into town, maybe find a hotel. As I turned to leave, something made me stop. The closet door. It was moving, not swinging open, not slamming shut, just nudging forward, like something inside was pressing against it. I ran out of the room. I sat in my car for a while, gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe. My heart wouldn't slow down. I should have just left, driven away and never looked back. But something about this whole thing didn't sit right. If someone had been in the house last night, why hadn't they done anything? Why just watch me? And how the hell did they get inside? I forced myself to go back in. Stupid, I know, but I needed to check one more thing. I walked straight to the front door. Locked. I checked the windows. All locked. The back door, still latched shut. So how did they get in? Then I remembered something. The attic. In the tiny hallway near the bathroom, there was a small pull-down attic door. I hadn't thought about it before, but now I had a horrible feeling. I stood under it for a second, staring up at the square wooden panel. A thin string hung down, the kind you pull to open it. I pulled the string. The door swung down. Silence. I reached for my phone flashlight and aimed it inside. The attic was small and dusty, barely tall enough for someone to sit in. Cobwebs lined the wooden beams, but in the farthest corner, barely visible in the dim light, a blanket, a pile of clothes, empty food wrappers. Someone had been living up there. Before I could react, I heard it. A sound behind me. I spun around, just in time to see the closet door in my room creak open again. I ran. Straight out the door, straight to my car. I locked it, breathing hard, staring at the house, waiting to see if someone came out. Nothing. I called 911. I sat in my car, gripping my phone, waiting for the dispatcher to pick up. My hands were shaking. 911, what's your emergency? I tried to explain, but the words came out fast and jumbled. Someone was in the house. Someone had been living in the attic. There were footprints in the sand, noises at night, closet doors moving on their own. The dispatcher asked if I was inside the house. No, I'm in my car, in the driveway. Stay there. Officers are on their way. Do not go back inside. I wasn't planning on it. As I sat there watching the house, a horrible thought hit me. What if they weren't inside anymore? What if they were out here? My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head toward the desert behind the house. My headlights barely reached the edge of the sand. And then I saw it. A figure standing just outside the light's reach. Still, motionless, watching me. I barely had time to react before it moved. Not walked, not ran. It dropped to all fours and scurried into the darkness. I slammed my car into reverse, my heart pounding against my ribs. The cops needed to get here now. Less than 5 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights filled the dirt road. 2 officers stepped out, hands on their holsters. I practically jumped out of my car. Someone's been inside. Check the attic. I saw someone out there in the desert. One of the officers nodded. The other started toward the house, flashlight in hand. They moved fast, clearing room after room. I waited by the car, my legs feeling like jelly. Then, after what felt like forever, one of them came back outside. House is empty. My stomach dropped. What about the attic? The officer hesitated. His face looked uneasy. Yeah, there was someone living up there, but they're gone now. I shook my head. No, they were just here. I saw them, out in the desert. The cop turned to the dark open land behind the house. His flashlight barely cut through the vast emptiness, nothing but sand and silence. I knew what I saw, and I knew, deep down, that whoever, or whatever, had been watching me wasn't done yet. I left that night, didn't even bother grabbing my stuff. I just drove. The next morning, I called Airbnb support and told them everything. The noises, the footprints, the person in the attic. At first, they sounded concerned, but then, when they pulled up the listing details, their tone changed. "Sir, are you sure you stayed at the right property?" My stomach twisted. "What? Yes, of course, it was the listing under Gary's name." A pause. Then, "Sir, that listing was removed 2 years ago." I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. "What do you mean removed?" "I was just there. The host was responding to me." Another pause. Then, quietly, "The owner, Gary, passed away 2 years ago." I didn't say anything, because suddenly everything made sense. The cheap price, the lockbox still working, the host answering in short, vague responses, the house left exactly as it was but abandoned, and then the worst realization of all. If Gary was dead, then who had been answering my messages? I never got all my money back. Airbnb gave me a partial refund, but I didn't care. I just wanted to forget the entire thing. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that clicking noise, that sound just beyond the light's reach, and I wonder, what if they're still out there? I have stayed in countless Airbnbs over the years, some charming, some forgettable, and a few outright terrible. But none have left a mark on me quite like the house in Denver. As a travel photographer, I often seek quiet places to unwind after long days of shooting. This particular listing seemed perfect, an affordable 2-story home in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. The photos showed a cozy living room, a vintage kitchen, and a sunlit bedroom with bay windows. The host, Kevin, had stellar reviews, and his description of the house was detailed yet ordinary. There was, however, a small mention in the listing that stuck in my mind. Basement is used for storage, not accessible to guests. That didn't bother me. I wasn't planning on spending any time down there. My first 2 days in the house were uneventful. I spent my mornings exploring the city, my afternoons capturing shots of the skyline, and my evenings editing photos while curled up on the impossibly soft couch. The neighborhood was quiet, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of the floorboards and the hum of the old radiators. But on the third night, something changed. I'd been working late on my laptop when I heard it. A faint noise from below, a rhythmic, dragging sound, like someone pulling something heavy across the floor. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling or maybe the plumbing acting up. But then it happened again. Long, slow, deliberate. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound wasn't mechanical. It was uneven, organic. It reminded me of someone shifting furniture or dragging a body. I shook my head, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Old houses made noises. I went to bed, forcing myself to ignore the unease curling in my stomach. The next night, while reheating leftovers, I heard something new. Wooden floorboards creaking, not from the living room, not from outside, but from the basement. I turned off the microwave, holding my breath. The sound came again, a single, slow step, then another. My eyes darted to the basement door at the end of the hall. It was closed, but the padlock that had been hanging on the latch yesterday was now unlocked. A cold chill ran down my spine. Had I left it that way? I couldn't remember. I grabbed my phone and messaged Kevin, the host. Me. "Hey, I've been hearing noises from the basement. Is there any chance someone's down there?" His reply came almost immediately. "Kevin, oh, don't worry. Old houses creak a lot. No one's in the basement. Promise." There was something about his casual response that unsettled me. The phrasing, the speed of his reply, like he had answered this question before. I went to bed that night with my door locked, but sleep didn't come easy. At 3:12 a.m. I woke up suddenly. The house was silent, unnaturally so. Then from down the hall, a noise. Not footsteps, not creaking, but a breathing. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was faint but unmistakable. A slow, ragged inhale and exhale. It was coming from the basement door. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a hardcover book, and crept toward the door, stepping lightly on the hardwood to avoid making noise. The breathing was still there, steady and unhurried, as though whoever or whatever was down there knew I was listening. I reached out and pressed my hand against the door. The breathing stopped. Then something knocked. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the book. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen. Then, ever so slowly, the door handle turned. I bolted back to my room, locked the door, and grabbed my phone with trembling hands. I called Kevin. He picked up on the second ring, his voice groggy. "Hey, everything okay?" I wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. "There's someone in the basement." Silence. Then, a sigh. "Look, I wasn't exactly up front in the listing." "What?" My grip on the phone tightened. "There's a guy down there. He's been there for years, but he's harmless, I swear." My stomach dropped. "Are you out of your mind? You rented me a house with someone living in the basement?" Kevin exhaled. "I don't list it because it scares people off, but he's never caused any problems." I could barely process what I was hearing. I opened my mouth to scream at him, but then, a sound from the hallway, the basement door creaking open. I ended the call and turned off the lights. If I could see out, they could see in. I sat in the dark, straining to hear. Soft footsteps in the hall. I reached for my phone again and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on the open basement door. The figure standing there was barely visible. A man. Tall, thin, his clothes tattered, his face obscured by stringy hair. He didn't move, didn't blink. Just stood there, watching. I forced myself to speak. "Get out." My voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm calling the police." No response. Then, with deliberate slowness, he smiled. I backed away, heart pounding. My phone slipped from my fingers and hit the floor. The light spun, casting erratic shadows against the walls. By the time I scrambled to pick it up, he was gone. The basement door stood open. The darkness beyond it felt infinite. I ran. I didn't even pack my things. I grabbed my car keys and sprinted out of the house, peeling out of the driveway without looking back. I drove straight to a motel on the other side of town, shaking so hard I could barely check in. The next morning, I reported everything to Airbnb. Kevin's listing was removed within hours. I never found out what happened to him, or the man in the basement. But sometimes, late at night, when I stay in unfamiliar houses, I think about that smile, and I wonder how many other Airbnbs hold secrets beneath their floors. Los Angeles wasn't new to me, but this time felt different. I had flown in from Boston for a big jiu-jitsu tournament and had planned to split an Airbnb with some teammates. At the last minute, things fell through, and I had to book a place alone. I was already exhausted from the flight, so I just grabbed the cheapest spot near downtown without thinking twice. I should have thought twice. The Uber dropped me off in a sketchy-looking neighborhood just outside of East Hollywood. Run-down houses, broken streetlights, and a gas station that looked straight out of a horror movie. I thought about canceling and getting a hotel instead, but I rationalized that it was just a place to sleep. I wouldn't even be there that much. The Airbnb was a small studio, attached to the main house where the host lived. No sign of the host, though. I had no idea what they even looked like. Their profile picture was just some random black and white logo. I had messaged them earlier and they just sent me a 6-digit door code. The first red flag? The code was 00. That was odd, but whatever. Maybe they were just some old person who didn't know better. The studio itself was basic. One bed, a tiny kitchenette, and a single door leading in and out. The only window faced the street, covered by thin, yellowing curtains that didn't fully close. I locked the door and double-checked it. The lock felt flimsy, but at least it was something. By 9:30 p.m., I was already in bed scrolling through my phone. That's when I heard it. A knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft tapping on the window, directly in front of my bed. My stomach dropped. I stayed completely still, waiting to hear it again. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind. Then, another knock. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak. Hello? My voice came out steadier than I expected. Silence. 2 minutes passed. Then, knock. Okay. Nope. I sat up, my body now fully awake and alert. Who is it? I called out louder this time. Nothing. I grabbed my phone and messaged the Airbnb host. Hey, is that you knocking on my window? Minutes felt like hours. No response. I kept staring at the window, my mind racing. I couldn't see anyone, but the idea of someone just standing there freaked me out. I considered getting up and checking, but something in my gut told me not to. At 10:30, my phone buzzed. A message from the host. I was going to bring you some water, but you looked like you were sleeping. I left. Nope. No way. Who knocks on someone's window to bring them water? Why not the door? Something was wrong. I thought about stepping outside to check my surroundings, maybe even walking to the store just to clear my head. But something told me to stay put. By midnight, I was still awake, heart pounding, every little sound outside making my skin crawl. Then I heard it. The unmistakable beep of a keypad being pressed. Someone was at my door. I sat up, barely breathing. The first attempt failed. Then, I heard another set of beeps. Then, a soft click. The lock had opened. Without thinking, I threw the blankets off and sprinted to the door just as it started to creak open. I slammed it shut with everything I had, my weight pushing against it. From the other side, a deep, calm voice spoke. This is my room. My hands were shaking as I shoved the lock back into place. No, it's not. Get out, I yelled, grabbing my phone. I hit 911. The person on the other side didn't leave. They just stood there, breathing. I screamed again. I'm calling the cops, making sure they heard me. That was enough. After a long, tense pause, I heard footsteps retreating. I stayed by the door, heart hammering, waiting for the police to arrive. When they finally did, they weren't surprised. The cops showed up about 10 minutes later. I barely waited for them to knock before ripping the door open, practically tripping over myself in my rush to get outside. 2 officers stood there, both looking more tired than alarmed. One of them, a tall guy with graying hair, glanced past me and into the studio. All right, he said. What happened? I told them everything. The knocking on the window, the weird message from the host, the door code being used, and the voice claiming the room was his. The whole time they just listened, barely reacting. When I finished, the second cop, a younger guy, sighed. Yeah, we've been out here before. My stomach dropped. Wait, what do you mean, like, this place? I asked, pointing back at the studio. The older cop nodded. We've gotten a few calls about this Airbnb, people reporting odd stuff. Usually nothing we can charge anyone for, but he shrugged. It's enough to be a pattern. That was not what I wanted to hear. So what happens now? I asked, shifting nervously. The younger officer glanced toward the main house. We'll talk to the host. They knocked on the front door, and after a few moments, it swung open. And for the first time, I saw Medal, the Airbnb host. He was older than I expected, maybe late 60s, with thin white hair and sunken eyes. He wore a loose button-up shirt that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. But what really got me was how calm he was. He leaned against the doorframe, smiling like we were old friends. Officers, he said smoothly. What seems to be the problem? I took a step back, The older cop didn't waste time. "We got a report of someone trying to enter this guest's room tonight. Any idea what that's about?" Midal blinked slowly, then tilted his head at me. "Oh dear," he said, voice full of mock concern. "Did you have a fright, young man?" My skin crawled. "I didn't imagine it," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Someone tried to get into my room." Midal sighed dramatically. I see what happened. Must have been a mix-up. You see, sometimes the previous guests forget to check out in the system. My friend probably assumed the room was still his." I stared at him. Lies. That friend knew the code. That voice wasn't confused. It was calm, certain. The younger cop didn't look convinced either. "What's your friend's name?" Midal hesitated. Then, too quickly, he said, "Jonathan." The older cop turned to me. "Did the guy say his name?" I swallowed. "Yeah. He said his name was Midal." Silence. For the first time, Midal's smile faltered. "That's ridiculous," he muttered. "Why would he say that?" The cops exchanged a look. And then, to my horror, the older one just shrugged. "Well, there's not much we can do. No crime was committed." My stomach tightened. "Seriously?" The younger cop gave me a sympathetic look. "We can stick around while you get an Uber. Probably best if you head out." That was all I needed to hear. I went back into the studio, grabbed my stuff in under a minute, and booked the first Uber I could find. The cops stayed near their car while I waited out front. Midal hadn't moved from the doorway. He was still watching me, not angry, not apologetic, just watching. When the Uber finally pulled up, I practically jumped inside, slamming the door shut. As we pulled away, I risked one last glance back. Midal was still standing there in the exact same spot, staring, but this time he was smiling. And as we turned the corner, disappearing from view, a horrible thought hit me. He knew exactly when I was arriving. He knew when I'd be asleep. And if I hadn't woken up in time, I might have never woken up at all. The Uber ride felt like the longest drive of my life. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Midal's house still somehow in the distance, like it was following me. I knew that was impossible, but I also knew that whatever had almost happened in that Airbnb wasn't just a misunderstanding. The driver, an older guy with a thick New York accent, noticed my tension. "Long night?" he asked, glancing at me through the mirror. I hesitated. "Yeah, something like that." I debated telling him. Maybe it would sound crazier out loud. Maybe it would make more sense. But instead, I just looked at my phone, scrolling through my Airbnb messages, my hand still shaking slightly. Midal's last response. "I was going to bring you some water, but you looked like you were sleeping." Stared back at me. And then, I did something I hadn't thought to do before. I scrolled up, and that's when I saw it. There was another message, sent just 5 minutes before the knocking started. It was from Midal's account, but the wording was off. "I see you arrived. You look very tired. I hope you rest well." I felt ice crawl up my spine. I never told him I had arrived. I never saw a doorbell camera, no security footage. So how did he know? My fingers hovered over the screen, but I didn't reply. I just stared at the message, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The driver pulled up to a cheap motel near downtown. It was the closest thing I could find that wasn't another Airbnb. "You good, man?" he asked as I fumbled for my bag. I forced a nod. "Yeah, just tired." That wasn't a lie. The motel was grimy, but it had a deadbolt and no keypads. That was enough for me. I threw my bag down and collapsed onto the bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. The knock on the window. The slow, calm voice. "This is my room." I finally gave up and grabbed my phone again, opening up the Airbnb app. I went to Midal's listing, ready to leave a scathing review. But it wasn't there. The listing was gone. I refreshed the page. Nothing. I searched for his name in my messages, account deleted. A sick feeling twisted in my gut. Airbnb hosts don't just delete their accounts overnight, unless they have a reason to. I started searching online, looking up any news about incidents in that area, and that's when I found it. 3 months ago, a guy had gone missing. He was last seen checking into an Airbnb in the same neighborhood. The article didn't give many details, just that he was a solo traveler who had been in town for an event. His friends reported him missing when he never showed up the next morning. And then, something else. A comment on the article. Just one. If you stayed on Redwood Street, get out. If they don't get in the first night, they wait until you sleep. I dropped my phone. Redwood Street. That was where I had just been. My stomach churned, and for the first time all night I felt truly sick. I had been awake, alert. I had stopped them. But if I had fallen asleep, I don't know what would have happened. I don't want to know. I left LA the next morning. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not at the tournament, not to my teammates. I just competed, packed my bags, and got on the earliest flight back to Boston. I haven't used Airbnb since, and I never will again. We needed a break. Emily and I had been drowning in work, and a weekend getaway in the woods sounded like the perfect reset. We found a listing on Airbnb, an old off-the-grid cabin deep in the Green Mountain National Forest. Hundreds of 5-star reviews. No electricity, just a wood stove and candlelight. Sounded charming. We pulled up just before sunset, the car kicking up dust on the narrow dirt road. The place looked different from the pictures. The wood was older, more worn. It sat alone, swallowed by the thick forest, no neighbors in sight except for a small rundown house about a mile away. That belonged to Frank, the host. Frank was waiting on the porch when we arrived. Older guy, maybe in his late 60s, with deep lines on his face like he'd spent decades squinting into the sun. His handshake was firm but quick, and he didn't waste time with small talk. "You two keep to yourselves and stay inside after dark," he said, his tone casual but off. I laughed. "Bears?" He didn't smile. "Something like that." Emily and I exchanged glances, but we let it go. We weren't exactly city kids. We'd camped in Yellowstone, spent nights in the Adirondacks. Nothing out here could scare us. That first night was exactly what we wanted. We cooked a simple dinner on the wood stove, played cards by candlelight, and listened to the sounds of the forest through the open windows. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. By 10, Emily was exhausted and climbed up to the loft to sleep. I wasn't ready to turn in yet. I stepped outside with a cigarette, enjoying the silence. No cars, no buzzing streetlights, just the hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then, something cracked in the woods, loud, close. I turned, peering into the trees. Nothing but blackness. Probably a deer, I told myself. But just as I was about to go back inside, thud. A deep, heavy knock against the side of the cabin. I froze. "Was that you?" Emily's voice, groggy from sleep, floated down from the loft. "No," I called back. "Was it you?" Silence. Then, thud, from the other side this time. A shiver ran up my spine. I stepped back inside and locked the door. "Probably a branch falling," I muttered, more to myself than her. Emily didn't answer. She was wide awake now, sitting up in the loft, hugging her knees. The cabin felt different. The cozy warmth from earlier had drained away, leaving only silence. And then the sound came again. A long, deliberate scraping, like metal dragging against wood. Emily was already scrambling down from the loft before I could say anything. She wasn't the type to scare easily, but I could see the tension in her face. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, sweeping across the walls and floor. Everything looked normal. No shadows shifting, no movement outside the windows, just the eerie stillness of the woods. Then, scrape, scrape, scrape. It was slow, purposeful, coming from the back of the cabin. I swallowed hard. My first thought was an animal. A raccoon, maybe. A bear. But bears don't drag things against wood like that. I moved toward the back window, careful not to step too loudly. The flashlight flickered as I shined it outside. Nothing. Then Emily sucked in a sharp breath and grabbed my arm. "The car," she whispered. I turned the beam toward our SUV, parked about 100 feet away on the dirt driveway, and someone was standing next to it. Not moving, just standing there, facing the cabin. The flashlight wasn't strong enough to make out their face, just the outline of a tall, thin figure. Their head was tilted slightly, like they were watching us. "Holy crap," I whispered. "Is that Frank?" Emily shook her head. "No, that's not him." I shut off the flashlight. My pulse pounded in my ears. Maybe if we stayed quiet, they'd leave. Maybe this was some local messing with us. But then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching on the dirt and fallen leaves. They weren't coming from the driveway anymore. They were circling the cabin. Emily and I backed up to the center of the room, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. Then, tap, tap, tap. Fingertips, right against the glass of the nearest window. I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The moonlight barely lit up the edges of the trees, but I knew something was right there. Emily grabbed my wrist. "We need to get to the car." I shook my head. "No way. If they're out there, that's exactly what they want." The tapping stopped. Silence. And then, from the roof, a loud, dragging sound, like something heavy moving directly above us. We stood frozen in place, eyes locked on the ceiling. The weight above us shifted, slow and deliberate. Scrape. Scrape. It was moving toward the edge of the roof, right above the front door. Emily grabbed my arm. "We can't stay here." I nodded. But where could we go? The loft? No way. We'd be trapped. The car? That meant running out into the dark, toward whoever, or whatever, was waiting. Then came the worst sound yet. The door handle rattled. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't the wind. Something was trying to get in. Emily took a step back, gripping the fireplace poker like her life depended on it. I held my knife tight, my hands shaking. And then, silence. Not just quiet. Dead silence. No wind, no crickets, no rustling trees, just nothing. I could feel Emily's breath, short and panicked, beside me. We stood like that for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, waiting for the next sound, waiting for something to happen. And then, from the window, a face, pale, hollow, eyes black as the night, pressed against the glass. Emily screamed. I staggered backward, knocking over a chair. The thing outside didn't move. It didn't flinch, just stared. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I didn't wait. I grabbed Emily's hand, yanked the door open, and bolted for the car. The night air hit us like ice. My feet pounded against the dirt. I could hear Emily gasping behind me, could hear my own heartbeat slamming against my ribs. The SUV was just ahead, 20 feet, 10. Then from the trees, the sound of running. Something was coming. We reached the car, yanked the doors open, and threw ourselves inside. I fumbled for the keys, hands slick with sweat. Click, click, come on. The engine roared to life just as something hit the back of the car, hard. Emily screamed. I slammed the gear into reverse, flooring it down the dirt road, dust flying up in the headlights. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, standing in the middle of the road, just at the edge of the forest, the figure. Tall, thin, staring, watching us leave. We didn't stop. We didn't speak. We drove straight through the night, not slowing down until we reached the highway. I sent a message to Frank the next morning telling him what happened. His reply was short. You left before it got worse. Be thankful. We never went back, and we never found out what was waiting for us in those woods. I had been running on fumes for weeks. Back-to-back shifts at the hospital, barely any sleep, barely any food that wasn't out of a vending machine. I was burning out, and I knew it. So I booked a cabin, a secluded getaway in the Blue Ridge Mountains, Georgia. The listing promised solitude, stunning views, and total peace, everything I needed. The host, Daniel, seemed friendly in his messages. He welcomed me, said I'd love the place, and told me to reach out if I needed anything. Relax and enjoy, he wrote, signing off with a smiley face. He seemed genuine, so I had no reason to doubt him. The drive was long, winding through dense forest until I reached the small gravel road leading up to the cabin. The place was gorgeous. Big floor-to-ceiling windows, a rustic fireplace, a deck overlooking a deep gorge. It was perfect. The air smelled like pine, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves. After weeks of hospital chaos, the silence was almost unnerving. But as I curled up on the couch with a book that first night, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Relief. The next morning, I woke up feeling more rested than I had in months. A message from Daniel popped up. Hope you slept well. The sunrise from the deck is amazing, isn't it? Seemed like a nice check-in. I replied, yeah, slept great. The bed is super comfy, thanks. He didn't respond. I spent the day exploring the area, hiking a few trails, taking pictures, just soaking it all in. It was weirdly surreal being so far from the sterile white walls of the hospital, like stepping into another world. When I got back in the late afternoon, another message from Daniel appeared. Hope you enjoyed the trails. The view from the deck at sunset is breathtaking. I hesitated. I hadn't mentioned hiking. I hadn't told him what I was doing. Maybe it was just a lucky guess. I mean, what else do people do around here? I shook it off and focused on making dinner. No point in overthinking. I tried to ignore the weird feeling creeping in, but something about Daniel's message stuck with me. Later that night, I settled onto the couch with a blanket, a cup of tea, and a movie. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting warm, flickering light across the cabin. I was finally starting to relax again. Then, my phone buzzed. The couch looks cozy. The fireplace is a great touch, isn't it? I froze. My eyes darted around the room. The only light came from the fire and the glow of the TV. My reflection stared back at me from the huge windows. It was pitch black outside. I hadn't mentioned the fireplace. I hadn't mentioned sitting on the couch. This wasn't a lucky guess. A cold, crawling sensation spread through me. My stomach knotted as I slowly turned toward the windows. The darkness outside was impenetrable, like a wall. I couldn't see a thing beyond the glass. But if someone was out there, they could see me. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. Maybe Daniel had just meant it in a general way. Maybe he wasn't watching me. I grabbed my phone and typed a quick reply. Yeah, it's nice. Thanks for checking in. I hit send. Then I got up, walked to the windows, and pulled the curtains shut. I went to bed with a strange heaviness in my chest, keeping my phone close on the nightstand. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The room was silent, except for the wind rattling the trees outside. Then I heard it, crunch. A single deliberate footstep on gravel. I held my breath. Another step, then another. Slow, careful, close. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe. Please let it be an animal. Then the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise itself. It was thick, suffocating. I lay frozen, heart hammering, staring at the door, waiting. Nothing happened. Minutes passed, then an hour. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. Eventually, exhaustion won. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, making everything feel normal again. Almost. I made coffee, stepping onto the deck to clear my head. That's when I saw them. Footprints. A trail of them, leading from the tree line straight to my window, right to where I'd been sitting the night before. A heavy weight pressed down on my chest. Someone had been standing right there, watching me through the glass. I rushed inside, locked the door behind me, and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking as I opened Daniel's messages. I was about to call him, demand an explanation, when another message appeared. Hope you're enjoying your stay. Let me know if there's anything I can do to make it even more comfortable. Something inside me snapped. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't a coincidence. Daniel had been here, watching me, and he wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. I needed to leave. Now. Panic set in. I grabbed my bag and threw in whatever I could reach. Clothes, my phone charger, my wallet. I didn't care if I left things behind. I just needed to get out. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip my bag. The weight of Daniel's last message sat heavy in my chest. This wasn't just some weirdly attentive host. He was here. He had been here all along. I peeked out the window. The footprints were still there, stark against the morning frost. I couldn't tell how fresh they were, but the thought that he might still be nearby made my stomach churn. I snatched my car keys off the table and rushed to the door, fumbling with the lock. My fingers felt numb, sluggish, like I was moving through water. I yanked the door open and stepped onto the porch. That's when I noticed it. More footprints. This time leading from the tree line to my bedroom window. I practically ran to my car, my heart hammering in my chest. The second I slammed the door shut, I locked it and started the engine. As I backed down the narrow gravel road, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. But there was no one. Just the endless forest swallowing up the cabin behind me. I didn't breathe properly until I reached the highway. At the first gas station I found, I pulled over and called Airbnb. My voice was shaking as I told them everything. The messages, the footprints, the feeling of being watched. They took me seriously. They promised to investigate. They even refunded me in full. A few days later, I got another call. Daniel's listing had been removed. He was banned from the platform. But that wasn't the worst part. A friend of mine in law enforcement did some digging. Daniel had been reported before. Other guests had complained about strange messages, noises outside at night. One even caught him lurking near their cabin at 2 a.m. I thought I had been careful. I checked reviews, picked a highly rated place, but none of that mattered when the host himself was the threat. Even now, months later, I can't book a rental without triple-checking every detail. I check the locks, the windows, the security cameras, because the scariest part wasn't the thought of being watched. It was knowing that I had been watched the entire time, and I never even knew. I was desperate for a quiet place to focus, somewhere I could lock myself in and finally finish my article. After hours of scrolling through Airbnb listings, I found the perfect spot, a historic Victorian house in Charleston, South Carolina. The photos were stunning. Tall windows flooded the space with natural light. The floors were polished hardwood, and there was even a cozy little writing nook overlooking a lush backyard garden. The reviews were glowing. Guests called it a hidden gem, praising the host's attention to detail. I booked it instantly. A week in a picturesque home away from distractions sounded exactly like what I needed. The excitement lasted until I pulled into the neighborhood. Instead of charming streets lined with oak trees, I found myself in a rundown area. Some houses were boarded up, others had graffiti splashed across their walls. A few broken down cars sat abandoned at the curb. A police cruiser crawled past me, the officer inside giving me a look that sent a chill down my spine. Maybe I'd taken a wrong turn. I checked my phone, but no, this was it. The house itself matched the listing, though. A little worn down on the outside, sure, but inside, it was beautiful, clean, well lit, and welcoming. I convinced myself the neighborhood was just rough around the edges. After all, I'd be spending most of my time inside writing. I unpacked, set up my laptop in the writing nook, and tried to settle in. But from the moment I sat down, something felt off. Every time I glanced outside, I caught people standing on the sidewalk staring at the house. Sometimes it was a single person, sometimes a small group. They weren't talking, weren't walking, just standing there, watching. Once I saw a man pacing back and forth across the street, eyes locked onto my car like he was memorizing every detail. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just a different kind of neighborhood than I was used to. Then the first night came. I woke up to muffled voices outside. Groggy, I peeked through the curtains and saw two figures standing on the sidewalk, gesturing toward the house. I held my breath, waiting for them to notice me, but after a few minutes, they moved on. I told myself they were just passing through. The next night, I wasn't so sure. Around 11 p.m., while I was working late, a faint thump came from the side of the house. Not loud, but enough to make my stomach tighten. I froze, listening. Nothing. Probably just the house settling. But the feeling that someone was out there wouldn't go away. On the third night, the neighborhood felt eerily silent. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, like the world is holding its breath. And that's when I heard it. A slow, deliberate scratching against the window frame. At first I thought it was an animal, but the sound wasn't random, it was careful, methodical, like someone was testing the window. A cold knot tightened in my chest. I crept toward the front window, careful not to make a sound, and peeked through the blinds. A figure was there, bent over the window, hands pressed against the glass. I dropped to the floor, heart hammering in my chest. My fingers fumbled for my phone. I crawled toward the corner of the room, keeping out of sight, and dialed 911. "There's someone trying to get into my house," I whispered to the dispatcher, voice shaking as I gave her the address. "Stay on the line," she said, her voice calm. "Officers are on their way." Minutes stretched into eternity. The scratching turned into a dull thud, like someone testing the window's strength. I gripped a book, like that would help if they got inside. Then, silence. I forced myself to peek again. The figure was gone. Blue and red lights flooded the street moments later. Two officers knocked on the door and I let them in, still shaking. They searched the property and found nothing. But near the window, they spotted fresh scratch marks on the frame. Footprints in the dirt led toward the backyard fence. "Looks like someone was trying to break in," one of the officers said, scanning the yard with a flashlight. "Probably thought the place was empty." "But it's not empty," I said, voice tight. "And this isn't the first time I felt like someone's watching me." The officer gave me a long look. "You sure you want to stay here alone?" I didn't answer. The officers left after taking my statement, but their words stuck with me. "You sure you want to stay here alone?" I lay awake for hours, every little sound making my pulse jump. The house felt different now. Not cozy, not safe, just exposed. By morning, exhaustion weighed on me, but I wasn't ready to give up yet. I called the Airbnb host. He answered on the second ring, his voice cheerful. "Hey there, how's your stay going?" I hesitated. "Someone tried to break in last night." Silence. Then, "Oh, huh." That was it, just, huh. I gritted my teeth. There were scratch marks on the window. The cops found footprints in the yard. "Yeah, well, you know, Charleston has its quirks." "Quirks?" I snapped. "Someone tried to get inside. Why didn't you mention the crime rate when I booked this place?" Another pause. Then, in a quieter voice, he said, "Look, it's happened before, a couple of times, but it's never been serious." I hung up, my blood boiling. He knew, and he let people stay here anyway. I should have left right then. But part of me wanted to prove I wasn't scared. That night I locked every door, double-checked every window, and sat at my laptop trying to work. The neighborhood was quiet again. Too quiet. Then I heard it. A creak, like footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. My breath hitched. I turned off my desk lamp and crouched low, barely daring to peek toward the window. And then, a shadow moved past the front door. Tall, thin. It didn't knock. It didn't try the handle. It just stood there, waiting. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the cops again. But before I could dial, the shadow turned and stared directly at me through the window. I felt ice shoot through my veins. Whoever it was. They knew I was here. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they walked away. No rush, no fear, just leaving. Like they'd be back. The next morning, I packed my bags. I was done. I called the host again, this time to tell him I was leaving early. He didn't even act surprised. "I get it," he said. "Sometimes the city's a little intense." Intense. That was one way to put it. But as I loaded my car, something nagged at me. Had this happened to other guests? Did they all just leave, like I was doing now? I pulled up the listing again, scrolling through the reviews, all glowing, all 5-star, too perfect. Then I saw it. A review from months ago, hidden in the middle of the page. Beautiful home, but the neighborhood is unsettling. Felt like I was being watched the whole time. Didn't sleep well. Won't be back. It was the only negative comment. And suddenly I realized the host had probably deleted the bad reviews. A chill ran through me. I didn't waste another second. I threw my bags in the car and drove off. Later that night, from the safety of a well-lit hotel room, I reported everything to Airbnb. I attached photos of the scratch marks, the footprints, the police report. They refunded me and said they'd look into it. I don't know if they ever did, but I do know this. Every time I travel now, I don't just check the house, I check everything. Because sometimes a place looks like a dream in the pictures, but turns into a nightmare once you step inside. I left that house behind, but it didn't leave me. Even as I checked into my hotel, safe behind multiple locked doors and surrounded by people, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake. Not by leaving, no, that was the smartest thing I'd done all week. But I had stayed too long. Something about that place wasn't right. And I didn't just mean the neighborhood. Lying in bed that night, I pulled up my camera roll, scrolling through the pictures I'd taken of the house. Proof for Airbnb, evidence of the scratches on the window, the footprints in the dirt. Then I froze. One of the photos, taken the morning before I left, showed the hallway mirror. At first it looked normal, but as I zoomed in, my stomach twisted into a knot. A reflection, faint, blurred, not mine. Someone else had been standing behind me when I took that picture, and I never saw them. The police didn't have much to say. Could be a trick of the light, one officer told me when I called. Or maybe someone was inside but left before we got there. That wasn't comforting. The next day I checked Airbnb again. The listing was gone. Either the host took it down, or Airbnb finally did something about it. I wanted to forget it, to move on. But a few weeks later I got an email. No sender name, no subject line, just one sentence. "You should have stayed." I never replied. I never told anyone. But every time I check into a new place now, I scan every mirror. I check every window. Because sometimes the danger isn't outside, it's already inside, waiting.